We demystify what goes on behind the therapy room door. Join us on this voyage of discovery and co-creative conversations. This is the Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast, with Bob Cooke and Jacci Jones.
Welcome back to the Therapy Show Behind Closed Doors with the wonderful Mr. Bob Cooke and myself, Jacci Jones. And what we're going to be talking about in this one is sexual tension in the therapy room and what we can do about it. Do we need to do anything about it?
Well, it's an exciting topic, and I'm still lingering over this cold. So, but I do like this topic because it's very sort of, as a supervisor, I get this topic a lot. People, sort of therapists come in with this, and I mean, the first question really is, where does the sexual tension originate from? I mean, in one sense, of course, we can say that it's in the therapy room and it's a physical manifestation, but is it actually sort of come on within the transference? In other words, where does it originate from? Is it like erotic transference, for example?
Yeah.
Which we did a podcast on a couple of years ago, I think. We talked about.
I think we've touched on it, definitely. Yeah.
Is it in the realm of exotic transference, or is it in the realm of the physical manifestation between two adults? It's very common, though. It's a very common
misunderstanding sometimes as well, maybe, of what the client is actually feeling.
Say a little bit more.
Well, just having that safe space and being seen and heard. Could that be misunderstood as feelings of affection for somebody? I don't know.
Yes, of course. I think I think the best way to look at this is, what ego state are we talking about?
Yeah.
So in other words, being heard for the first time, being listened for, being accounted for, nurtured. Can they all sort of be confused in the era of sexuality? People talk about the difference between love and lust and things like that.
Yes.
And I think that's what you're talking about. And I think there's an element of that in some way, or could be. I mean, I often think about this, and it's interesting that, how can I explain? When I hear the story of somebody, the trauma or whatever they're coming from, then maybe my sexual tensions, which I had at the beginning, actually dissipate, because I work very developmentally. And when people talk about their trauma in their earlier history, then I very much in touch with the developmental process rather than actually maybe the adult to adult process in the room. So a very attractive person walks in the door, and maybe there's a physical attraction or there's sexual tension there. However, when I work with the trauma or the developmental arrest from a different age, interestingly, what might have been there in terms of sexual tension or sexual attractiveness disappears.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Because I'm dealing with the younger self rather than the adult
What's
presentation,
the adult,
of the person that comes in the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why I talked about erotic transference, and what age of the person I'm actually dealing with.
Yeah.
That's been very common for me. I mean, it might be attractive for the person in the room. However, when I'm working developmentally and there's a younger self of the person, that often that sexual aspect we're talking about dissipates.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense, because it's not adult to adult a lot of the time.
It's often, because you're dealing with a 6-year-old or the 8-year-old or the 10-year-old, and that's the transference. So that's an important thing. And I think of that generally, by the way, that, I've done a podcast here about what happens when you don't like the person that comes in the room. But, once you listen to their story, and especially if you work in a developmental level and you come across the child trauma or whatever we're talking about here, then my stance or my attitudes, my feelings often are very different.
Yeah. Are we always working on a developmental level?
Well, here we are. What a wonderful question. I think if you're trained to think developmentally, so for example, if you think that, you know, the past affects the present, and when people come to therapy, if they could resolve it themselves in their adult processes, they would be. They would.
Yeah.
So they come to therapy, and of course, the cure, if you like, or the healing, isn't in 2024 or 2025, should I say
No,
now.
yeah.
It's, in 1994, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And so I was trained to work developmentally. I think developmentally. Does therapy always have to happen from a developmental perspective? Well, no, because you could, it depends what you call therapy. You can have a training in, solution focused therapy or CBT or therapy where you'll stay in the here and now. And I think that's fine. And I think some certain curative factors can happen in brief focused therapy or short-term therapy or CBT, obviously. It's not how I was trained though.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. Secondly, when somebody first comes into therapy, very quickly, as you listen to their story, especially the way I work, they start coming or talking about the vulnerable parts of themselves. And often as they do that, they start coming from a younger ego state.
Yeah.
So very quickly you're into a developmental perspective. Link that with the way that I think, then that's, into the area of developmental therapy.
Yeah. I think that's where I was kind of going with it when, you know what I mean? Because obviously I trained at the Institute. So, my training was the past affects, the present. So we're always going backwards, really.
Mm.
Yeah.
Or thinking backwards.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, that's why I started with about ego states and which part of the state you're actually getting, you're transacting from. Let's go back to the questions a bit though. So if you're going to stay in an adult to adult process, or there are sexual tensions, which I've certainly been part of, the question is, what do you do? Now, I can tell you what I did.
Yeah.
I'll take an example. So I remember very well quite a few people, but I think one person particularly, who was a very attractive woman in this sense. And, I felt very attracted to her and I wondered, oh, can I work with this person? Because there was that tension in the air, definitely from my perspective. So the first thing I did was take this scenario to supervision.
Yes. Yeah.
That's my first port of call. Also, I was in therapy at the time, so that's also, I went to both to talk about. And in supervision, as we explored that, in the case I'm particularly thinking of, and who she reminded me of, where that came from, and XXXX, and I started to put things together. Then, as I started to explore that, the tensions around my repressed, I don't know, sexual fantasies or whatever way you want to talk about it, dissipated.
Yeah.
Then I was left with a choice, and we talked this through in supervision. Would it be in the service of the client to say, well, I'm sexually attracted to you, and that from this perspective doesn't really help because it gets in the way perhaps of what we need to do in terms of psychotherapy. And I taken this to supervision, and he suggested I talk about it and talk about where we go from there in terms of options, and that would be passing on to another therapist and finding out and she also said she was sexually attracted to me. So sense of humanity. The two adults were attracted there. And what I did anyway, in this particular case, I'm thinking about, I referred her on to someone else.
Yeah, that's a safe option, really, isn't it? Because we are only human, and it is a unique space that, you know, the therapy room is.
And she reminded me of somebody I went out with for quite a long time with. So, you know, it's like it was very difficult to be the therapist she needed me to be in this neutral space.
Yeah,
And actually, part of myself was somewhere else.
yeah. Which is what transference and counter-transference is all about, isn't it? It's our stuff as well. Do you know what I mean? That we've got a past and a history, and certain people trigger that part in us or remind us of somebody. Yeah.
And talking about it, and she said she felt attracted as well. So this person certainly reminded me of my own history. The other option, you know, perhaps I could have worked it through in therapy, and that would have got to a different place. I mean, that's the option I chose. Another person, I remember take the supervision, and that was clearly about something from my own history. And in fact, as I worked in therapy, I was much more able to see the person or the client, if you like, and I took a different route.
Yeah.
So I think ethically, I think the first place of call is definitely a supervisor, and therapy if you've got a therapist. And I think, you know, if that doesn't shift, then you need to, you know, refer on.
Yeah.
Talk about it.
Yeah. And again, that links into having, you know, professional boundaries, or, you know, boundaries within the therapy room, and, you know, personal boundaries as well on what you actually decide to do.
So do you have is this sort of, is there anything from your own practice where there may have been something similar for yourself?
I'm not sure about sexual tension. I definitely have an affinity with certain clients more than others, and feel, I'm not sure whether the word is an attraction, but yeah, maybe.
Because you can find people attractive, and it doesn't have to be at a sexual tension
That's it.
level.
Yeah,
You can find
yeah,
say, oh, they're attractive, and it doesn't mean that, you know, the part of you feels repressed
yeah,
or back, or any of these sort of inhibiting factors here. I mean, that's different, I think, because you can see somebody's attractive and still work with them.
yeah,
When part of yourself, or you lose part of yourself, or your vitality is repressed, or you aren't able to work it through in therapy and supervision for whatever reasons, I think that's different from acknowledging from an adult place they're attractive.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, I don't know. I was conscious of being biased towards this person, if that kind of makes sense.
Yes.
I've bought into the story a lot more, maybe. I wasn't, you know, yeah, I wasn't being objective, maybe.
Well, I think if you have tensions, which when I say tensions, I mean the part of yourself is energetically walled off, if you like,
Yeah,
because to get in touch with that type of energy might mean that you aren't the therapist you need to be, and to think clearly and to do the work.
yes, yeah,
I think ethically, in fact, actually, you need to refer on
yeah,
after you've discussed it in supervision.
yeah. So
Yeah.
supervision is the first protocol. What else can we do?
Therapy.
Yeah,
I took the supervision. I took it to therapy because they're both in the same week as it happened. I didn't wait for a month to see my supervisor, by the way. I got an emergency session.
yes, yeah,
Talked about them on the phone. And she made a space for me, and I went and talked about it. I also saw my therapist, and actually I also talked to some colleagues of mine, and
that can be helpful, can't it? Do you know what I mean? Speaking to other people that have experienced the same thing.
Yeah,
because
very
it
much
is
so.
quite a sensitive topic to be discussing with people.
Yeah, but it's also very normal when you've got two, and this it could be the same sex or opposite sex, but we've got two people who, well, certainly from my side at that stage before I found out she was attracted to me, yeah, that it's normal in a way because, you know, I was in a particularly big therapy room at the time, so you're in this quite small therapy room talking about very close, intimate things. It's not abnormal for two people to be attracted to each other.
No, absolutely
From an
not.
adult place. I'm not
Yeah,
talking from a child parent place or a regress place or an exotic transference, by the way.
yeah,
I'm talking about from an adult to adult. That's not abnormal. And in fact, I think that if my supervisor or my therapist had made it abnormal, then we're in a different ballpark. But both of them took helped me explore
yeah,
exotic transfer, to explore, you know, where I thought those feelings came from and other things. And then we came to the conclusion that this was part of a human encounter, if you like.
yes,
Ethically, I needed to say something, which I did. Now, I've also been in a situation, by the way, where someone has said to me they feel hard to do therapy because they're attracted to them and felt they were in love with me. Different words, interestingly enough. And when I took that to supervision, I felt that was more in the air of exotic transference and what she was transferring onto me because I didn't feel a reciprocal
yeah,
process. I felt more, if I felt anything, it was more like I was a parent to her, you know. So that's a different. I thought I was in the realms of exotic transference, and then we were in a different type of supervision. And
yes,
what do we do then from that place? And that's, I think, from a previous podcast I did a couple of years ago, I talked about erotic transference and where that may or may not come from in terms of idealization and met relational needs, and various other concepts in the transference world. And we worked through that because then I framed it in the transference process, and then she started to understand it in a different light.
yeah,
We we're in a different journey.
yeah, because that can be a really valuable part of the therapeutic process, exploring things like that.
Yeah, because you see, in the English language, you're a bit trapped. There's only one word for love. But
Yes,
in the Greek language, I've just come back from holiday. You have, I think, 4 or 5 different words for love. Agape, eros. I can't remember the whole 5 of them, but there's different words. Whereas in the English language, you just have one word for love.
yeah,
So you're into a different world when you start talking about different types of love. And you're in a different world if you start thinking about erotic transference and what's transferred onto you, but actually comes from the past rather than the present.
yeah. And the power dynamic can be quite attractive to some people as well. There's lots of things that can happen within that space.
And does happen.
Yeah,
It would be unusual for somebody who's worked a long time, several years as a therapist at least, if they haven't encountered that a client hasn't either verbally said, I have loving feelings towards you, or that hasn't been a part of the therapeutic process in some way. I think that would be unusual.
and again, I think whether you're experienced or inexperienced, it can be handled differently. I think with experience, like you say, it can be quite a natural thing to happen between two adults in a room that they're talking about intimate topics.
That's right. And my experience often is the young therapists, well, and experienced ones, but I was thinking people I've supervised who have brought this subject into the arena get scared
Yeah.
can get scared that they're feeling attractive, and they start thinking, oh, that means I'm going to act out on my feelings, or I'm going to XXX, and they get caught away with it all. And they need supervision about finding out if it's transference for themselves, or where that comes from, and what this fear is all about, because they can't work with the person, obviously, if they're frightened.
No, and it can be difficult if you're involved in it to actually work it out for yourself. You do need that third person.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean? To
Mm.
look at it from an objective point of view.
Mm. And sometimes, usually the case, by the way, if you take it to supervision and then therapy, you start to work out where this all comes from, whose feelings are they? Because, in both these cases, one, as I talked about it, clearly it was very clear for my side. And the other case I was talking about, then it's like, well, I don't feel those feelings myself.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they've been transferred onto me and I am actually feeling them and they're not from me.
Yes. Yeah.
So you have,
That's a powerful thing. When that happens, it is a powerful feeling that you have.
yeah, it's a projection which is put onto you,
Yeah.
and from somewhere else, like your own child ego state, you may identify that projection.
Yeah.
So the feelings haven't actually come from you, but they've been projected onto you, often as a defense process. So you do need to talk about this in the supervision, rather than just struggle on manfully, or from
Yeah.
whatever perspective we're talking about. Stoically is probably a better word, because if you struggle on stoically without talking about it in supervision or taking to therapy, then your purgatory, if that's the word, or your scare, or whatever it's all about,
Yeah.
will go on longer.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and you're not experiencing it to the full extent either. Do you know what I mean? You kind of sticking your head in the sand with it because, whether it's inevitable or not, but potentially it is going to happen again. So, you, do you know what I mean? To work through the process in supervision or your own personal therapy
I
is,
remember, now I'm talking about it more, I remember another case where I was talking to a supervisor about, and different from the first one I just meant, that I was feeling some sexual tension, and she said again, this was a couple of years later, whose feelings do you think they are? Do you think they've been projected onto you, or do you think it actually comes from a here and now process? And interestingly, the second time or third time, whatever time it was, I felt much clearer in my head that those feelings have been projected onto me. Because the whole concept of projective identification, which is in the world of unconsciousness and transference, and if it's unconscious, it's harder to decode, of course,
yes,
to
yeah,
come from an unconscious process. But all sorts of feelings which a person doesn't want can be projected, and is projected quite often to the therapist: anger, shame, envy. So why not sexual feelings?
yeah, it makes
So,
sense. Yeah,
so we can pick up with it
yeah,
unconsciously, yeah,
yeah,
and then identify them from, in some way, perhaps from our history, and act out perhaps in ways which are unwise. So, but we actually feel it comes from us, when actually the origin
yeah,
may well mean not.
yeah. And that
Now,
is really confusing as a therapist sometimes.
very.
Yeah,
And I think the concept of projective identification and transference can be very grounding in this process with your supervisor, because when you start thinking about whose feelings are they, and could they possibly be projected onto you, and then talking about the contract you've got with your client, and why has she come,
uh,
and maybe she's come because she's got relationship issues, or whatever it is, and you can start maybe unraveling some of the things in the therapy is very grounding.
Yes. Yeah.
And the next bit, of course, if you are going to use it, is how you then bring that whole subject up in a way that they don't feel ashamed and everything else that goes with that.
Which is a big thing. Yeah. Yeah.
So they can start to use this in a transference way, or understand it from a transference perspective, which can be quite healing.
Yeah.
So all this is can be quite complex, and very hard to resolve yourself because you're in it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the overriding thing for me is, the confusion of the feelings, and like you say, whether they're ours, whether it's being projected onto us, whether it's reciprocated, whether it's adult to adult or whatever it is very confusing.
Yeah, so I went back just to follow through. So I'm not talking about the first time where I actually tried to refer it on, because after conversations and everything, I thought this actually came from me in the here and now. But I'll talk about this another time. So I was thinking that I wasn't attracted to this person at the beginning. 6th session in, I started to feel these sexual feelings. And I was talking to my supervisor, came from the conclusion that this comes from me, it originates from somewhere else. And talking about the things that she was working with, I could start putting 2 and 2 together, whether they made 5 or 6 or 4. So what I chose to do is I went back. And I've got to think about how you do all this, because what I wanted to do was bring back, my feelings and see if it linked in with unwanted material that she was unconsciously projecting onto me, which might be useful to look at in terms of the therapeutic process. But of course, you have to think about shame and all how you do it and all sorts of things. And I went back and I said, because I think it's about the 9th session, I said, just before we continue, I've got something I would like to talk about, which has come up from the last session. And that was that I started to feel sexual feelings in the room, and I started to wonder. So I took it back to my supervisor, and we were wondering whose they were, even though I felt, did they come from me? Because no disrespect to you are an attractive person. I didn't have those feelings when I started working with you.
Yeah.
Is there something happening in your world which may be unconsciously just you're projecting onto me? Yes?
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope this was an adult to adult transaction. And she said, oh, it's funny you say that, because I often have these processes in relationships. And I go, and we don't discuss them. And I forget, I can't remember where it went, but I do remember that it was very useful.
Yeah. And I think that's a really nice way of putting it, that the sexual tension in the room, not mine, not yours. It's just here, it's in the room, and I can feel it. So there's no blame or shame connected with it. Yeah.
Did it link back? This is several years ago. Did she go back to her father and talking about the situation with her father? I don't remember, but I do remember the apprehensiveness I felt myself, because it was the apprehensive, not so much about the subject matter, but I didn't want to inadvertently shame her.
Yeah.
So thank goodness it worked out quite well, and we used the unconscious processes, or the potential of the unconscious processes, which may have come from, which we then routed back to somewhere else, which got enacted out with me as an attempt to get a different outcome that she was used to in other relationships.
Yeah. Which again, I know I've said it in the past in podcasts, once we're aware of a certain behavior, we can do something with it. And I think, transference is one of those things that most of us aren't even aware that it can happen. And if we have a feeling, we just take it that it's our feeling that we're feeling.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And usually in therapy, it isn't.
Yeah. I can remember in group process, when we were doing training, I'm not an anxious person generally, but feeling so anxious and feeling like I was having a panic attack, it was so strong and so powerful, but it wasn't mine.
Mm.
And it took me a while to process the powerfulness of that feeling that didn't actually belong to me.
Yeah, there we are, perfectly. So I think supervisors need to ask the questions, whose feelings do you think they could be if they don't feel they're yours, or at least to explore it.
And I think it's a valuable lesson for us and anybody listening, is to also explore the feelings that we have, and are they ours or are they somebody else's? You know, particularly if we're in a relationship with somebody, it's so easy to pick up on somebody else's feelings.
And I think in the world of therapy, it's the most natural thing for clients, and it's in a conscious process again, to project out feelings that they actually don't want.
Yeah.
Or to enact out a process with the therapist that they're not even aware they're doing.
Yeah.
And if the therapist can find a way to bring these processes back into the therapy, it can be used to process or decode often healthy processes, unhealthy processes which have been going on, which haven't had the place to decode or look at.
Yeah.
It demands a lot of courage from the therapist, I think. It demands the therapist think about how they bring the conversation into the room. But the step before that is to talk about this in supervision and therapy to find out where all these processes originate from.
Yeah.
And that doesn't take away from the fact you can have, like I said at the beginning, you can have feelings of attraction with somebody from the age I was at that time, which was 38. I mean, the two of the world, it could be a physical attraction, but the problem is that may, and I would say it's really important to refer on, because it's very difficult for a therapist or a client to work together when they're attracted with each other.
Yeah.
Because then there's a different energetic state.
I agree.
Both people are in.
Yeah. Well, another wonderful podcast, Bob.
Is it? I think it's a good way to start the new year to talk about these things.
Well, we've touched on it quite a bit on this one, but what we're going to be looking at the next one is, do we always have to address the unconscious process within the therapy room?
Oh, that's a perfect one. Leads on from this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So until next time, Bob, thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back next week with another episode.